implications of it, as well as to bring the Jewish community together just in conversation, since we are physically distant right now. Today, we are honored to have Senator Dickerson as our guest. Senator is a two-term senator, chair of the state and local committee. He's an 8-year member of the Education Committee and a member of the Senate Ethics Committee. He's an anesthesiologist in Nashville. He's been married to Katrina for 28 years and is the father of 3 sons, and he is an avid guitarist, so he's a great fit for Nashville. Senator, welcome. We're going to start off by asking you to just give us a brief overview of your efforts around voting for the upcoming election, and then we'll take questions from the audience after that, if that works for you.
Perfect. Well, good day. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much. So I've been interested in sort of expanding the right to vote and making it easier for the last several years. I started with actually felons and the restoration of felon voter rights. In Tennessee right now, if you commit a felony, and there's some specific ones that are excluded, but if you commit a felony in Tennessee and you serve your term or you're on probation or you get out on parole, it is very difficult to restore your voter rights. There's a financial barrier, and there's also a sort of a bureaucratic barrier. And that really didn't make sense to me. So over the last several years, I've been trying to work with a very wide-ranging group of advocacy groups, a wide-ranging array of advocacy groups, to try to simplify that process. And it spans the far left to the far right to the center. It's actually quite amazing how non-partisan that issue is. So that sort of whetted my appetite for the issue of voting in general. And a year ago, I got named to be the committee chairman in the Senate of the committee that oversees election laws in our state. And so as a result of that, I've spent a lot of time looking into the election laws, sort of, learning about how they work, how they don't work, how there are incentives and disincentives to people to vote in our state. You combine that with the pandemic, this is kind of a unique time in our state and our nation. What really got this to the forefront of my thinking was a bill that came through 2 years ago. And that really is what accelerated it. And I'm sure a lot of you all are familiar with this. There are groups that go out and register people to vote. There was a bill that came through that I was adamantly opposed to that essentially criminalized some of those groups. The concern being that there was some nefarious plot, some widespread effort to sign up, dead people and sign up people 3 and 4 times and basically steal the elections, sort of generically speaking. I was opposed to that bill. I voted against it, argued against it last year, along with Jeff Yarbo, one of my colleagues from Nashville. It passed. And as many of you all may know, the federal judge has actually stayed that law and has delayed its implementation. There was a cleanup bill that came through about 3 months ago that actually took some of the less controversial parts of that bill from 2 years ago and tried to codify them and bring them into statute. This is a long explanation, but here's the sort of the payoff. The part of that bill was a result of the tornado that swept through Nashville at the 1st of March. And what that bill did, in a very small part, was allow for super voting sites. For example, if your precinct or 2 or 3 precincts were rendered unusable in the lead up time to an election, you could combine all of those precincts into one super site. And that really makes good sense if you're dealing with a tornado or a flood or any number of other, sort of natural disasters. It really doesn't make sense if you're dealing with the pandemic. The very last thing you want to do is bring large groups of people into close contact with each other, standing in line, for maybe hours and hours. And then, here's the worst case scenario. They go through the polling place that is staffed by people who are on average about 70 years old. And those are the folks, if you look at the studies out of Italy, and I know this is not directly applicable, but in Italy, of the people that have died from the coronavirus, about 99% of them are 60 years old and older. And so, light went off in my head as a physician who's also a legislator. This is an unintended consequence of this. And so I became an advocate for more widespread absentee voting. I tried to amend that bill twice, once in committee and failed, and then I tried to amend it once on the floor, and that failed also. But there's still ongoing efforts, but that's sort of how we got here. I had sort of an underlying interest in voting. It got peaked last year with this bill, and then this year, sort of the confluence of the pandemic and this bill coming through, I really got fired up about it. I've been working along with a number of folks pretty tirelessly on it.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about how we as a community could help out with those efforts?
Sure. So, I would tell you that the Nashville delegation, which is made up of 3 senators, it is Senator Gilmore, Senator Yarborough, and myself. Senator Hale has a small sliver over near the Hermitage. His main part of his district is in Gallatin. I have not spoken to him specifically about this bill, but Yarborough, Gilmore, and I agree that we would like to expand absentee, and let me be specific, no excuse absentee voting for the remainder of 2020. And we can talk about some of the nuanced stuff about absentee voting in Tennessee also. We would like to expand it for the duration of this pandemic. The House delegation, I believe, and though I've not spoken to all of them, I believe is 100% supportive of it. And so really in Nashville, you've already won. You don't have to lobby us. You don't have to encourage us. We're all in lockstep on this. What I would say is it's actually the areas out of Nashville that could use the help. And so if you have friends, if you have similar organizations in Knoxville or Chattanooga or Memphis, this needs to be a statewide effort. And so, again, I appreciate and people send me nice emails all the time. I don't get just complaints, believe it or not. One of the first, this is no kidding, one of the first emails I got 8 years ago when I got elected said, "I'm typing slowly because I know you can't read fast." And that was like, wow, thanks. But most of what I get are my constituents who are unable to access certain parts of the state government. The unemployment issue recently has been the number one thing, but I get a lot of complaints. People complaining about the governor, people complaining about the mayor, people complaining about the World Health Organization, or any number of things that are out of my purview. But I get a lot of attaboys too, where people say, "Hey, thanks for your stand on this." And I think this has really struck a chord in Nashville. I think most people in Davidson County sort of understand intuitively that if you have an infectious disease that can be spread by coughing through droplets or through aerosolization, and you have a group of people that are working at the polling place who are 70 years old and older, that's like oil and water. The two just don't mix. So it needs to be a statewide effort, though. Davidson County is on board.
Okay, I have just a couple of more questions myself, and then others who are listening, if you would like to post your questions in the chat, I'll make sure that we convey those to the senator. First off, Senator, could you tell us, remind people who maybe don't know, what is the current law? So what does it take to now get an absentee ballot? And so the change would be that anyone can get it for any reason, but what's our law right now in Tennessee?
Right, and so there's some specific groups of people that can get them now. For example, if you're 60 or over, you automatically can request an absentee ballot and get one. And by the way, it's already open for the August primary. You can go ahead and request your absentee ballot now for the August primary. If you are chronically ill, if you're in a long-term care facility, I believe specifically if you're in the military, if you're a student and you're at a distant campus, let's see, there are a couple where they're 8 or 10. Let's see, if you're going to be out of town, if you know you're going to be out of town for all the early voting dates and election day, you can go ahead and request. And in fact, I'm sending out a mail reminder to my constituents with the list in the next couple of weeks. So most all of you should be getting one of those. But those are the big ones. And really, we already have absentee voting in the state of Tennessee. It's not like we're inventing the wheel. We're expanding the wheel. And I know that there are a lot of different areas of pushback against this. And some of them are sort of the traditional. We're worried about it being some nefarious intent. People, gathering 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 ballots in a place and filling them all out and sending them in and swinging an election, voter fraud.
Right.
I understand it, and there probably would be some of that, but I just don't think it's going to be enough to warrant the level of concern we have. This truly is a public health dilemma, and we are truly faced with some individuals who, let's say somebody who's 55 years old. I'm 55, for example, and maybe I just don't feel comfortable going in there. Maybe I may be a germaphobe. I may just be worried about or maybe I've got some asthma or high blood pressure, any number of chronic conditions that might not qualify me right now for an absentee ballot. But that person should not be put in a position to decide whether to protect his or her health or to exercise their right to vote. And that's ultimately what it comes down to me. I don't think that should be a disincentive for somebody to be able to vote.
I agree. The last question for me before I start with the chat questions is, why doesn't everybody think that? This has become a really contentious issue. And I have a hard time understanding, and I think some of our other community members too, why isn't everybody on board with getting as many people as possible to safely vote?
I have no earthly idea.
Okay.
Yeah, but so I'll be frank here though, and I know this is going on YouTube. It's being recorded, so this is all on the record. I think in the center of the political society we have, there's sort of a bell curve, if you will. And for those of you who studied statistics, the people that are within 1 or 2 standard deviations of the mean, probably all of them would agree if we got a chance. Not all, no, not everybody agrees on everything, but a large, vast majority of them would agree if they sat down and thought about the risks and the benefits and how few people actually vote in Tennessee. We're near the bottom of registration as a percentage and then turnout. And Jim Cooper and I have been working on this for years in a completely nonpartisan effort. We've gone to high schools and registered kids when they're 17. You can register when you're 17 if you're going to turn 18 before the next election, I believe is the stipulation. And we've gone through the high schools. We've had meetings with the League of Women Voters. If y'all have not seen this, they did a great video on it comparing older people and younger people and what they thought were appropriate pizza toppings. It was actually extremely well done. And it sort of talked about voting and about the importance. And the irony of this is, of all the people that don't vote, young people don't vote in the largest numbers. And in the mayoral race, and I've had the sorry about that. I was getting a phone call right there.
Oh.
Yeah, I've served with 4 Nashville mayors, and when the race that David Fox and Megan Barry came down to be the finalist a number of years ago, it was as hotly contested a race during the lead up. There were 5 or 6 very attractive candidates, people that had sort of their different angle on things. In the youth turnout, I think it's the people under 25 voted maybe 8% or 10%. It was unbelievable. Most recently in California, they just had a U.S. House race within the last couple of weeks, and they did 100% mail-in. I believe, and I think I saw an article in the Post or the Times on this. They sent a ballot to every registered voter, and the people under 30, I think 12% of them turned in their ballots. And I mean, literally, it's like sitting on the kitchen counter. And I don't know what the process is, but check a box, sign it, drop it in the mail, you're done. And only 12%, 1 out of 8. 1 out of 8. I'm sorry, and I apologize. I'm doing this on my iPad, and I get texted and called on it. Only 1 out of 8 of the young voters even turned it back in. And again, the irony being, if you're 80, and we're just talking simple math here, if you're 80, you've got another 5, 10, 15, 20 years that your vote is going to impact. If you're 18, you've got 70 or 80 or 90 years. You've got a lifetime that a vote could change the arc of your city or your state or your nation. And so I can't explain it. I will tell you, nationwide, however, the push towards absentee voting right now, and at least for the rest of the 2020 cycle, has changed dramatically. And I think I'm pretty close on my numbers. 4 states basically have mandatory mail-in voting. I think Utah, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, maybe.
Yeah, and Hawaii. There's
okay.
actually 5. Hawaii also, right?
Okay, and actually, you're the one that tipped me off, by the way. That I investigated after our phone conversation. So thank you. I think about 30 have some variation of no excuse absentee voting, where you can just get one if you want to. And then there are about 15 that have some gradation, where if you have a chronic illness or if you're going to be out of town, you can get it. Of those 15 or 16, I think 11 of them have actually expanded that temporarily. And there are only about 4 or 5 states now that have sort of held the line on this. And again, it puzzles me. It seems to be nonpartisan. I think if you're again, I said the 2 standard deviations in the middle tend to agree on most stuff here. It's the folks on the extreme that sort of get, are the contentious ones, as it were. And I think probably folks on both extremes have some belief that maybe somebody else is trying to steal the election. And I just want people to vote safely.
Right. One of our questions is that AARP Tennessee apparently has sent out an email with the absentee ballots to people who are over 60 and wondering how else we can get the message out about who has access now.
Great question. So think Tennessee, and there are a couple other groups that are very active. AARP, obviously, and I know the elected officials, as I just said. One of the things I'm going to do is send out a sort of a mass mail piece saying, hey, if you qualify. And so here's the tricky part, and I'll sort of peel back the curtain here for a minute. I'm not sure if I should encourage people to absentee vote or just let them know that it's an option. I'm not sure where my role as a policymaker and elected official, and my role as an advocate, where that line is. But I, personally, if I were 70 years old and I had the chance to absentee vote, I'd absentee vote. I've had a number of constituents who are poll workers email me, and most of them have encouraged me, please do something with absentee voting. Please expand that. We don't want to have hundreds and thousands of people show up and potentially communicate, the coronavirus. Right. And frankly, a couple of them I've said, thanks for your service, but if I were 70, I'd have some real reservations about working at the polls.
Sure.
And of all the concerns I have, where we're going to hit a bump in the road potentially, it's that we won't have enough poll workers.
Right.
Because I think a lot of them are going to be justifiably concerned and probably not volunteer in the number. It's not volunteer; they get paid, right? Not work in the numbers.
Okay. One of our viewers is from the League of Women Voters, and she just wants to point out that in Tennessee, we actually, even though young people don't vote, we make it hard on them because apparently the first time you vote, you have to swear in person or go to the ROTC on your campus in order to be able to get an absentee ballot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I had a bill to correct that also last year. And it didn't pass. So, and again, there's a gradation of, philosophy. They're hardcore right wingers, hardcore left wingers. Where I stand is somewhere I confuse everybody. It's sort of my shtick. I either amuse or irritate people across the political spectrum, and so I actually have seized on this voter rights issue, and again, expanding access, easing access, but I'm not 100% a day of registration. For example, some states you can walk up and register on election day. I'm not there. I do believe that you should have some sort of proof of ID at some point, and there should be a minimal process through which you go to verify who you are. That can take place over days or weeks in advance. So just so you know, I've drunk a lot of the Kool-Aid, but I'm not drunk all the Kool-Aid on this issue. But the point is a great one, and I had a number of people who are constituents, and some of the doctors I work with said, "Hey, my son or daughter turned 18." let's say August 1st, after their senior year in high school, they registered to vote. They headed to a distant school, California, let's say, asked for their absentee ballot, and were told they had to show an ID to, again, an ROTC, or actually had to go in for the first time and show their photo ID, driver's license, or some other government. I think that's overly restrictive. Again, we're not, the math doesn't work to me. We're not talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. This is a pretty small group. Number two, if they misrepresent who they are, and if they get an absentee ballot, it is voter fraud. I mean, so
Right.
what we're saying is these people are college students. Let's say they're going to UCLA, and they go, aha, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to commit voter fraud while I'm at UCLA and subject myself to be a felon. So that the logic behind it doesn't work either. And so what my bill basically said was, if you were in that circumstance, it's a pretty narrow group. Again, this is a number of thousands of people who will leave the state and go elsewhere to college for their freshman year for the first cycle. This is a pretty small group. You could hold up your driver's license and essentially take a selfie and send that in with your absentee ballot to show that you are in fact the person who has that driver's license. And you could essentially send a selfie. I think Harold Love and I had that bill together in 2019. And the workaround with technology would actually be pretty simple. And so we had a bill to address that, but it's still a problem.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through with other questions. So, do you have thoughts on people with mental health diagnoses like anxiety and depression who are young and seemingly healthy, millennials, for an example,
Right.
who want to continue social distancing for the sake of protecting themselves physically and emotionally and others, and for working to continue to try to flatten the curve? So what would be the reasons why we can't allow absentee voting for them? I think you've already talked about your position on this. Yeah.
I would extend it to them. And even if, let's just say we got to a point where you could say, okay, if you have some sort of coexisting illness, I think I'm a believer that psychiatric and psychological diagnoses are comparable and equivalent to medical diagnosis. I don't consider schizophrenia any different than high blood pressure. It's, they're medical diagnosis. So I would find that an equally valid. If you said that you had lung cancer and were on chemotherapy and didn't want to be around a group of people, I think everybody would understand why you have a compromised immune system and your lungs aren't strong. I would consider, a panic disorder or anxiety disorder to be comparable to that. So it would be equivalent.
Okay. We have one
Leslie,
question. Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is Deborah. I was just going to jump in on something here for the voting before we move to another topic. I just wanted to, just as a personal note. So my husband is over 60. He applied for his absentee ballot. He just got it today in the mail. It came quite quickly. Again, I think following up on some of these other pieces of why other people. So here I have no legitimate, based on Tennessee law, reason to absentee vote, but I care for my husband who's over 60 as well as my mother who's in her 80s. So that becomes, a little bit grayer. Also, as you said, there are several states where they've been doing all mail-on. Oregon's been doing it since 1998 with no concerns about fraud. The other thing that just as an informational, they don't find that this helps one party over the other. Finding that mail-in voting really is pretty neutral. So while I know it can sometimes be used as a political football, there isn't really evidence to support that. And also just one more comment on the poll workers. So for those that are younger and healthy and interested, I have registered for the training for poll workers, as has my daughter. I had read that is a major concern, that if we don't get into all mail-in voting, that there could be a concern about not having enough poll workers, since, as you said, Senator Dickerson, so many of them are in an age where their health would be compromised. So if anyone is interested, that all that information is at the Secretary of State site. Also, if you feel comfortable to go ahead and do the training to be a poll worker, it's pretty straightforward.
So let me jump in again. I'm an advocate for expanded absentee voting. No question about it. But I will also tell you, we can't just flip a switch on November 1st and make this happen. It's actually, from a logistics standpoint, would require some work. And there's a bill that Senator Katrina Robinson from Memphis has that would expand. Sorry, let me get another text there. That would expand absentee voting. That's going to come up when we reconvene in June. That I don't know the details of, but I'm intrigued by it. But just for example, in Tennessee right now, about 2.5% of the ballots are cast absentee. Current estimates are that potentially up to 30% could be cast absentee right now because of, people like your husband, who probably has voted in person for the last 40 years, and now he's voting absentee. I think we're going to see a lot of folks. So 2.5%, double that to 5%. That's a doesn't seem like a lot, but it's 100% increase in the logistics of the workload. And so this is a heavy lift. As I understand it, though, the federal government, through the CARES Act, has actually made funding available for all states to expand voter access during this circumstance. And I think there's a sort of an inside politics term in Tennessee. If you have a bill that you're trying to pass, they assign what's called a fiscal note to it. What will it cost to implement this? And in the dream world, you save money. You have a fiscal note where I'm a big criminal justice reform advocate. So if you don't have people in prison, it saves money and sort of makes the state money. But then you can have a fiscal note like this. I think Senator Robinson's bill was assigned a $1.8 million fiscal note. And that's a significant amount of money. But in the grand scheme of things, if we could simplify the voting system and open it up, $1.8 million that we can draw down from the federal government seems like a reasonable amount. One of the interesting things that the Secretary of State and Mark Goins have noted is if we go from 2.5% to 10, 15, 20, 30, 100%, which is not going to happen, the logistics of actually counting those ballots is going to be quite extraordinary. And I do grant them that. I think the law, and I'm not 100% sure on this, it needs to be postmarked by election day. And so if a lot of folks wait until midnight, send in their ballots, it could be days or weeks before we have election results. And that's not the worst thing in the world, but there are implications to expanding absentee voting, ones that we can overcome, to be sure.
What is your sense? I don't know that there's a fixed deadline for this, but one of the questions that came in is what's your sense of how much time we have left? So what would really be a feasible deadline for this to have impact for the November election?
So I think there are 2 or 3 sort of not lines in the sand. That's too strong a word, but sort of trip points. First of all, we're going back into session in 10 days. We recessed in March due to the pandemic. And we're going back in for, and this is a point that we can discuss too, that the Senate wants to go in for 4 days and the House wants to go in for 4 weeks. And they want to bring all the bills up, the permitless carry bill and, all the bills that are the ones that I think we would consider to be very controversial bills, whether you agree with them or not, they're controversial bills. The Senate wants to come and basically deal with mission critical bills. And I really will get to your question here to say this sort of roundabout way. Bills that have a positive fiscal impact on the state, for example, generate tax revenue because we're going to have a multi-$100 million shortfall due to the recession we're in. Bills that are specific for giving the governor the tools to deal with the budget over the next 6 months until we come back into session in January. And then any bills that might deal with the pandemic itself. I would tell you that I think the absentee voter bill fits very nicely in with the pandemic sort of specific topics. I think it's very, very specific to that. And hold on, I told you I'd answer your question and I forgot. Oh, the time frame. Yes, sorry.
Right.
So we have one bill. So the first time frame is June. Secondly, Jeff Yarborough and I have worked very closely on this, Senator Yarborough, who has the neighboring district to mine. And he came up with an idea that I've been actually advocating. And I haven't gotten a vehicle for this yet. But the general idea is pass a bill in June that gives the governor the latitude to look at the August primary. And if it's a real debacle, I mean, if we don't have poll workers and if there are lines that are 8 or 10 hours long, and if it just does not work, give the governor the latitude to pass some sort of enabling regulation that would allow for an expansion of absentee voting. Those are a little circuitous, but basically, don't pass the broader absentee voting bill, but give the governor the opportunity from a statutory standpoint to do it if August really does not work well. And then the third thing is, and I would say practically September 1st is the date that I have in mind. If August does not work, if we have a real problem, and if there's a second peak, we see the curve spike back up, and if people stay away in droves, we could always come back in with a special session if need be, and pass legislation that would expand things. And so September 1st, and again, I'm an advocate for expanding to no excuse absentee voting for the remainder of 2020. Just to be clear, you got to give them a couple of weeks or a couple of months lead up time. You can't snap your fingers on November 1st and do it. So is it 8 weeks? Is it 10 weeks? Something like that. We need to give the Secretary of State the proper lead in.
Great.
Leslie, sorry to jump in, but just one clarification. So we do have several wonderful representatives from the League of Women's Voters on our call, and they did give a clarification that for the mail-in ballot, it actually has to be received by Election Day, not post.
Oh, good.
Election
Good,
Day.
thank you.
So just as a clarification.
Good.
All right. Are there any other questions specifically about voting? If so, put them in the chat right now. Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions where they want to ask your opinion about other things, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we'll move to some other topics and we can come back to voting if other questions
All right.
appear.
So one of the questions that we got is, could you talk to us about the possibility of Medicaid expansion in Tennessee and your thoughts on that, or
Sure.
bipartisan efforts that could be made around that issue?
Right. So this has been probably going on for 4, 5, 6 years. I think Governor Haslam had his Insure Tennessee that he had advocated for. Dr. Rick Briggs was the Senate sponsor. And I've always been very open to the possibility and the concept. If you look at what it is, it's basically taking people that fall between the cracks. And this is probably overly simplistic, but the working poor in our state, folks who have jobs, who don't have health insurance, and who have no, what's the phrase? They don't have adequate access to the healthcare system. So can they show up in an emergency room? Yes. Could they walk in somewhere? Yeah, of course they go to health department. But in terms of managing chronic conditions and sort of keeping them from having small issues that build into larger issues, they are practically excluded, or at least have a lot of impediments. I'm a big believer in looking for a silver lining in dark clouds. And so this pandemic has been a huge dark cloud that has descended upon our state, our nation, and the globe in general. One of the things that I've talked to some of the other legislators in the Senate is that they think that this bill, actually, the potential for Medicaid expansion, will be revisited in 2021 and will gain some traction as a result of sort of our experience over the last 3 or 4 months.
Okay, great.
And I'll say this: the devil's in the details. And so
Always.
to be sure, you could phrase this or you could write it many different ways. You could write it a way it's dead on arrival, or you could write it a way that's very viable. And so I'd say the relative support for it's going to depend on the way it's authored and written.
Right.
Leslie, sorry, I have a quick
Go ahead.
follow-up on that. So I've had the opportunity to hear you on some other calls, and one of the things that continues to come up is sort of the rural-urban divide in Tennessee and how
Right.
certain things happen urban versus rural.
Sure.
And there does seem to be significant concern about rural healthcare and the closure of
Right.
all of those. Can you just say a few words about whether or
Sure.
not we go all the way to Medicaid expansion, what might be possible to help the rural communities?
Right. So, yeah, and you're speaking to a much larger topic, really. And I was just on the chamber had a lunch and learn 2 or 3 days ago, and Bob Freeman, who's a Democrat, whose district is within my district essentially, and we represent Creve Hall and Belmead and Oak Hill and Forest Hills together, and some other areas. And he and I both basically said urban Republicans and urban Democrats probably agree on more than we do with our rural colleagues, whether it's a rural Democrat or a rural Republican. It's basically Shelby County, Knox County, Hamilton County, and 1 or 2 others, and then everywhere else. Yeah, and we agree on a lot of stuff, but the Medicaid issue and the issue of healthcare is one that puzzles me to this day. If you look at the statistics in Tennessee, we've lost a number of rural hospitals, and there's a lot of debate as to whether Medicaid expansion would have saved those hospitals. And let's face it, it's paying patients in the door in those hospitals, and I think the math leads me to think that some of those hospitals, maybe not all of them, but some of them would still be around, and it's the very urban districts whose representatives and senators are most adamantly opposed to Medicaid expansion who are losing the hospitals. And so it doesn't make sense to me, but their constituents are our best advocates in terms of just considering the options and the possibilities. But I say this, I find it sort of bitterly ironic that it's their hospitals that are closing.
We have an issue, not just in Tennessee, but nationwide right now around masks. Can you talk to us as a physician?
For sure.
What do we tell our friends who say masks are stupid or it infringes on their rights to have to wear a mask?
So I'll tell you a great question. I'm not an epidemiologist,
Right.
but I play one on TV, as they say. So I wear a mask when I'm out most of the time. My wife and I, like, for example, she goes to the grocery store, or I go to the grocery store. I wear a mask at the Kroger or whatnot. If I'm at Home Depot, I wear a mask. If I'm out running in the neighborhood, I go out for a jog, I don't wear a mask. And so to me, there are 2 or 3 points here. First of all, I think any mask is better than no mask. Number 2, the CDC yesterday came out with, I don't know if you all saw this, it was sometime yesterday evening, saying that they were downgrading the risk of surface transmission. If you open a doorknob and then the next person comes by, they think that is less of a potent route of transmission than the aerosolized version. And so if you think about how this virus is spread, it's primarily, they think, a respiratory issue. And I'm sort of rambling, but I'll make a point here. There are 2 different ways, broadly speaking, that it can be spread in a respiratory manner. One is through droplets. If somebody coughs in your face and you actually get saliva that carries the virus, which is actually the greatest risk for me. I'm an anesthesiologist. I put breathing tubes in, put people on ventilators 8 times a day. And so I'm like at ground zero for transmission in my own practice. So droplets, if you wear a mask, even if it's a porous mask, and you cough, most of those droplets are going to be trapped in that mask. And I know there's some controversy about the masks that the state bought. I think they got 6 million masks from a sock manufacturer. And a lot of folks thought they looked really rinky-dink. They did a study, I think, at University of Tennessee a week or so ago that actually said they were more effective than people thought they were, because it stops the droplets. And not to be too graphic, but we're talking spit and saliva. And it, if it stops those big droplets of fluid, it's done a great job. The second way it's transmitted is through aerosolized particles. That is, they're sort of floating around, the random viral particle that's floating around. You have to have a pretty specific mask, the N95 masks, which are extremely, if y'all ever put one of those on, it is like breathing through a swizzle stick. I mean, it is miserable. And I wear those at work routinely. And you're like Darth Vader, and it's difficult to breathe, and it's difficult to work, and you get sweaty, and your glasses fog up, and they're a real nuisance. And frankly, they're overkill for most people. So as far as the civil liberties issue goes, I mean, I see their point, but my point would be, what's the downside? I mean, just
Right.
do your neighbors a favor. Put on a mask if you're at Kroger, or if you're walking through the hardware store in Hillsborough Village. It's not doing you any harm whatsoever to wear a mask. I think a lot of people think somehow it shows they feel they're weak or they're not virile if you're a man or something. I mean, I think it's civil, and it's good, sort of public health. And so I don't get it. I keep a mask in my car. When I go in, at Home Depot, I wear it. So I will. This is a story I told to one of my rural colleagues, and I got to tell you, this could not be truer. I live in a neighborhood with a circle, and the neighbors and I all have known each other for 10 or 20 years. And so we'll go out in the evenings and sit in the circle. And for example, the space station has gone over a couple of times. You can actually see the International Space Station. And so we'll go out in the evenings with a drink, and we'll watch for the space station. It fascinates me that you can see an object in space. And so we'll watch it. We sit 10 or 15 feet apart. I work in a rural county. My medical practice spans 4, 5, 6 facilities, and one of them is in a rural county. And occasionally I will stop by the Target in that county to get stuff. My wife says, hey, we need X, Y, and Z. The customers in the Target in this county are practically doing the conga line down the aisles. I mean, the concept of social spacing is non-existent. Nobody wears masks. They're bumping into each other, hugging each other. It is extraordinary how differently this is perceived within Davidson County. And this is not one of the ring counties, but it's actually the next step out. And to them, it's a non-issue.
Interesting. A question came in, pivoting to a different topic. Do you have any comments on school vouchers? This was something that it didn't seem like anybody really wanted for themselves. And the bill itself only applies to Davidson and Shelby counties, which to some people felt like being targeted.
Oh yeah. So yeah.
Thoughts?
Great. Oh yeah. So I'm totally completely opposed to the bill. And voted against it, spoke against it, argued against it, stomped my feet against it. And the funny thing is, when I got elected, I was a supporter of vouchers because they make sense to me. And in the abstract, there are a lot of things that make sense. In the abstract, there are a lot of things that work that in practice don't really have a whole lot of, let's say, good results. As I've heard it said 1,000 times, communism works in the abstract. Right? but when you put it in play, people don't care.
There's some kibbutzes in Israel that have made it work. Okay.
Well, so but on a grand scale, let's say it's very difficult. It's very difficult to make it work over the course of a million, 100 million, 300 million people. But that's just so school choice through vouchers. You have a child that's not doing well at some school. Take that money, school choice. You put them in another school. The child flourishes. Makes great sense in the abstract. There are no data that substantiate that. They've done some work in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina where they've looked at it. And I think Wisconsin is the state where most of the data comes from. And school, academic attainment, graduation, test scores, college matriculation. I'm unaware of any metric that vouchers have shown to improve. And so while philosophically I may support it, practically they don't work. And so I changed from a voucher advocate to sort of a voucher neutral person. And then when this bill came out, you said it seemed like it targeted Davidson County. It didn't seem like it did target Davidson County. It did target Shelby
I was
County.
trying to be polite.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. But I mean, I got up on the Senate floor and said, hey, if it's good enough for my county. Sorry, I'm very popular there. If it's good enough for my county, why isn't it good enough for your county?
Right.
So truly, I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, if the other 93 counties thought it was good enough for them, it'd be statewide, but it's not. There's sort of a philosophic argument. They're trying to jam this bill through. You know, this is our key piece of educational legislation. You know, the other thing is, if it's so good, how come it costs so much money? There's, I think, a $38 million cost with this. And when I was an advocate or a believer in the concept of vouchers, part of the appeal was you could, at the same cost or even a lower cost, have as good or better attainment. That's great. That's an efficiency. Let's have better outcomes at lower cost. It's perfect. Doesn't work that way. So we've not been able to show better attainment, and basically they had to kick in $38 million to make this program work. As you all know, I'm sure most of you know, a judge has I think the term is stayed. I say, I'm not sure what the proper term is. A judge has put a halt to it, and they actually went to the point where the judge said that they couldn't enroll kids or take applications for it, I believe, about 2 weeks ago, and so that's on hold right now. And you know, part of the constitutional principle, and this is one that we deal with a lot in the state, is if it's good enough for a small city, or if it's good enough for Nashville, or if Nashville needs its wrist slapped, or if Trousdale County needs its wrist slapped, how do you differentiate between counties or cities based on some underlying fundamental principle? And the answer is, it's very difficult to have a rule or a law constitutionally that applies to one county that doesn't apply to the whole state. And I think that's very fair. And so the general theme is, and I think this is what they're going to find, is there is no legitimate reason why Shelby County and Davidson County were singled out there. And if it's policy that's a benefit to the kids in those counties, it should be applied statewide. And frankly, I would have opposed the bill anyway, I think. But if they make it apply statewide, at least they're being consistent, and I'll give them credit. But I thought that was terrible piece of public policy.
Great. A couple of people put in questions about the kind of process by which the bill got passed. That was something that there were some stories about. And is it true that it only passed by one vote after Knox County was removed as one of the targets?
So that was, I think, in the House. And so
okay.
I was mostly focused on the Senate. I did get up on the Senate floor, and it's in the public record, so I can say it again now. But there was widespread rumor that there was some vote, you know, basically some arm twisting going on, and hey, you know, we'll build a bridge or something. We need the vote, yada yada yada. And that's actually been looked into heavily by the press. But I believe I've also heard that carving Knox out allowed it to pass. But again, I think that was a House issue, not a Senate issue.
What do you think the big issues will be in the resumed session? So presuming you guys win and that you go for the big issues rather than this 4-week-long thing?
Right.
And also the sub question here is, does the state budget need more trimming?
The answer, let's get to the second part first. The answer is probably yes.
Okay.
And I was on a teleconference with the chairman of Finance, Ways and Means in the Senate, Bo Watson, and I think he said our shortfall in this, here I'm being recorded as I don't quote me on this, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars. It's $400, $500, $600 million. And then next year, I think it's going to be about $1 billion. And so that represents 2 to 3% of our overall budget. And while that doesn't sound like much, that's a lot of state employees. That's a lot of state parks. I mean, that's a huge amount. I've served now for 8 years, and I'm running for re-election. I can tell you this: 7 of my 8 years, we've had budget surpluses, and that's a lot of fun. One of the years we had to come come back in and start cutting stuff. And I got to tell you, that is just gut wrenching. And I think the next 2 or 3 years in the state as a legislator could be pretty gut wrenching times, having to make some very difficult choices because our state has grown so successfully. Nashville has been such an engine of economic success and growth that we've had our predictions almost every quarter. We get more money in as a state than we expect, and we've, it's wow. This is fantastic. It's not so much fun when your predictions turn over. So I think your question was, what are we going to deal with over the next session? So my committee, for example, has about 9 bills in it. I don't think any of them are controversial at this point. I think we're sticking to the script that I told you before. It's either needs to bring revenue to the state. It needs to be time sensitive. For example, we have the Sports Hall of Fame. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but the Sports Hall of Fame, I think one of their members on their governing body has resigned. So we have to approve somebody for the Sports Hall of Fame, or they'll, I think, have an even number on their board and won't be able to take votes. If they could have a tie vote. Revenue issues, giving the governor some latitude. And then I'm unaware of any public health bills dealing with the coronavirus specifically. I'll tell you 2 of my bills that are widely disparate that I'm fighting for both of them though. And so one of them, and my committee that I chair governs election laws. It oversees prisons and the prison system in Tennessee, and it oversees liquor, alcohol, malt beverages. And so I've sponsored the medical marijuana bill every year. That's my number 1 bill. And since I oversee that, and I was an advocate for online gambling, they call me the vice chairman, because like a lot of my bills have to do with vices. And so one of the bills that I sponsored got through the Senate, and I think we're going to be able to pass. And this sounds so trivial, but it's a real, to me, it's very timely. And this is before the coronavirus. You can go now through your app and order all your groceries at Kroger. You drive up and they bring it up, but they can't bring you beer. So if you want to get a 6-pack of beer, there's no mechanism by which you can show an ID to the person who brings out your stuff. All my bill did was say you have to have the person who brings the food out to be 18 or over. I think they have to verify that you have a license that shows that you're 21 or over. And so you can get beer when you go pick up your groceries. So if you're trying to avoid crowds, but you like to drink beer, you can go in and you can get your food without seeing anybody, but then you got to park your car and go in and get your 6-pack of beer. And it's just not, it didn't seem logical to me. So I actually see that as a time sensitive bill. It predated the coronavirus issue, but it actually, I think it's important. And we've got a couple of bills like that that are sort of revenue enhancement bills, quality of life bills that I think will come up. I don't anticipate the really, really controversial bills coming up in the Senate.
Okay.
That's what I'm told. And I hope we're in session 1 to 1.5 weeks and then get out of town.
I want to be respectful of your time. So
Okay.
we have a few last questions. I'm just going to tell you all 3 of them and then let you talk what you feel like. So one of the questions is, you spoke about budget surpluses. Tennessee does have a large rainy day fund. And so is there discussion about using these funds instead of budget cuts? And then a kind of partner question to that is, what about using the reserves to help families given the massive unemployment situation? And then 2 other questions. One is if you would talk a little bit about your criminal justice reform work on just bail and things like that.
Right.
And then the very last question is, would you sponsor a bill for telehealth in Tennessee?
Right. So easy one. Last answer is yes. And actually, I sponsored the first telehealth bill about 6 or 7 years ago. So and I could talk there. And if I get distracted, remind me what the 3 questions were. I can remember the first 2. Okay, so telehealth, and one of the interesting things is who gets to practice medicine, who gets to call themselves a provider, who gets to bill insurance. Somewhat controversial. they have nurse practitioners, nurse anesthetists, you have nurse midwives, psychologists, therapists. And so this is a whole area that is super duper complex and very controversial. But if you have let's say a physician like myself, I'm MD, who provides one-on-one patient care, should you be able to do distant patient care and bill the same thing? And the answer is, I would tell you in most cases, yes, I think that's very appropriate. The tricky part is, how do you mandate that? Do you say, if you are an insurance company, Blue Cross, and you're providing insurance in Tennessee, you must cover at an equal level the fees? And so how much of that is a mandate versus how much of it is a natural evolution of the marketplace, versus how much do we need just to set the framework as a state that allows for that to occur in a natural progression? But the answer is, I support it fully. There are many nuanced questions. For example, the state only controls 15% of the commercial insurance regulation for covered lives in Tennessee. 85% are covered under ERISA and a federal law. So we can't even really do anything to those 85% mandatory. We cannot force them to do anything against their will. We can just set the framework. So the answer is yes, we need to set the framework and be a little bit more expansive. A couple of questions that we'll need to deal with, and this is what my first bill dealt with. If you are a physician in Kentucky, let's say you're an endocrinologist in Bowling Green, whose patient would normally drive up from Gallatin, 20-30 minute drive from Gallatin to Bowling Green, they can't make it. Are you able to bill a Tennessee-based health insurance company, whether it be TennCare or it's a Blue Cross of Tennessee, across a state line? So that's one of the issues. Number two, do you need to be licensed in Tennessee to treat patients from Tennessee from a distance? Should it be just the border states? We border 8 states. Should it just be the surrounding states? Should it be, could you be a doctor in Alaska or Hawaii? And so one of the questions is, should you have the same sort of malpractice insurance requirements? And then the final question is, could you actually be the world's leading expert in London on some obscure disease and be able to bill somebody who sits in Tennessee? So the answer is yes, but there are some practical sort of questions and some of the details you have to work through. You can't just flip a switch on that one, but the answer is yes. As far as criminal justice reform goes, I see the criminal justice system as a 3-part process. It's entrance, it's what you do to them in prison, how you treat them in prison, and then it's exit. And so the first thing, most obvious thing, is we need to do a better job deciding who goes to prison in Tennessee. We need to do a better job with, for example, mental health, drug treatment, drug courts. We need to have diversion opportunities where people who may be going down the wrong path. And Judge Seth Norman, for example, was a real leader in that. And there's a judge that's taken over for him. So we can spend small amounts of money before these folks get into the obvious slipstream to go to prison, and try to get them into the mental health system, try to get them treatment, try to get them therapy. And I do want to mention drug therapy before we leave off. Secondly, and this is actually within sort of my area of oversight, I don't have a lot of ability to do, sort of comment and change what happens in individual prisons. What I do is I oversee the budget, and they say, here's my budget for X number of millions of dollars. Is that appropriate? And we ask them questions. And last year we actually increased their budget because we thought the prison guards were woefully underpaid. They're having a terrible time attracting prison guards because the economy was so strong. And there were hundreds of prison guards short, and the ones that were working, were barely making ends meet. So my oversight's more budgetary. But I think one of the things we need to do in prison, and I think it's been shown time and time again, is we need to help people attain a high school equivalency degree. We need to help them with counseling if they're in, I think 40% maybe of people in state prisons have some substance abuse issue. It's a significant amount. And so we need to figure out ways to help them be successful when they finish their time in prison. And that's the area that I think we can, on my committee, and should I have 4 more years, that's the area that I'm going to focus on specifically. But then what do you do with these folks when they're done? And there are some great programs. And if y'all aren't familiar with Project Return, It's a local group that takes prisoners or people who are paroled or get out of prison and helps them get jobs, helps them become, tax-paying, maybe voting citizens in the state of Tennessee. And so there are a bunch of groups doing that, and I support them. One of the tragedies of our budget shortfall this year was Project Return. So every member of the Senate, they come say, hey, what are your 2 or 3 priorities if we have money left over, if we're going to make a grant? Project Return is always my number one group, and I then penciled in to get some money, and the money all evaporated. And so there was a third question
about the rainy day fund and
right. So the answer is, I think you asked a couple of questions. The answer to all of them is yes.
Okay.
The money in the rainy day fund is on the table for all potential uses, as far as I'm concerned. Bo Watson, the chairman of the Senate Finance, Ways and Means, will actually have the largest role in that. But if we can avoid, and I'll give you a sort of a budgeting principle that we adhere to in the state. We try to differentiate between one-time expenditures and ongoing expenditures. If you're going to go buy a car, you get a bonus at work, and $15,000 bonus. You can go buy a $15,000 car, and that's great. You don't go buy a new house knowing that you're going to be making mortgage payments for 30 years. And so we try to tailor those monies that we only have non-recurring money to things we can hit. So, for example, I don't know what the bureaucratic impediments might be, but we need more money for our unemployed folks in Tennessee. My staff spends 90% of its time. I got probably 3 emails and 2 calls this morning already, specifically people having difficulty navigating and getting the funds they are due from our unemployment system. So that would be, I think, a very, very viable option. So let me hit you with one more idea here. Mm-hmm. My other bill that's big to me this time, medication-assisted treatment is a big deal. If you're an opiate addict in Tennessee, if you're an opiate addict anywhere, medication-assisted treatment, what used to be the old methadone clinics, there are now newer medications that have taken the place of methadone. But medication-assisted treatment, along with therapy and counseling, has been shown to be much more effective at keeping people from having recurrent issues, falling into drug use again. And I've got a bill now, and Senator Briggs and I have overlapping bills. We're trying to combine them into one that would expand the authority of nurse practitioners under some very specific guidelines to prescribe Suboxone, and there are a couple of Suboxone, Subutex. There are a couple of different brand names. I got to tell you, it's a huge problem all across the state. It's an immense problem in East Tennessee. And I can assure you, I've not seen any data on this, but the pandemic, unemployment, stress, and anxiety that have occurred over the last 2 months have not done anything to improve people's tendency to start to use medications again and fall off the wagon. And so that's the other big bill I've got that I'm trying to push through in June.
Great. Senator Dickerson, thank you for joining us today.
You bet.
We've enjoyed talking with you. I appreciate you being willing to talk about how you changed your mind. It seems like there's not nearly enough of that among our elected representatives on all sides of the spectrum right now. So thank you again, and good luck to you. I hope that things are productive in the next few weeks.
Yep.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, maybe we can get a repeat of the, as we get into the legislature, maybe an update at some point down the line. And I just want to give another shout out to the League of Women's Voters, Debbie Gould, and other representatives who are on this call, to thank them for all the work that they do for our community. And again, thank you all so much. Again, no call next Friday, but hope to see many of you again on June the 5th. So thank you all.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.